Morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today for the very first webinar for our professional development series that we're doing. This first session is on economic development statistics. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to have a number of different webinars with different topics and some different speakers. Hope that you'll be able to join as many as possible. We have a lot of people on here from local governments, Indigenous communities, a lot of candidates that are running for political office, and all the best to you and good luck to you as well on that. It's an interesting topic and something that a lot of us don't really think about when we're getting into economic development and how diverse the need for statistics are. We have a very good speaker with us today. Jamie Vann Struth has been a speaker for us for a number of years at our economic development course, and he talks about this topic. Jamie's also a past Chairman's Award winner, and we congratulate him on that. And he's been a really strong supporter of the association, him and his consulting companies. So Jamie, over to you, and I think you'll begin sharing your screen.
Okay, great, thank you.
I should say that if anybody has any questions during the presentation, to please type it into the chat bar, and we'll monitor the chat and be able to interrupt Jamie if we need to. So.
Sure, yeah, that would be great. Okay, welcome everyone. As Dale mentioned, I've been speaking on this topic. I think it's more than 10 years now at the local economic development course. And he always puts me on the first day because I think he wants to get the hard stuff out of the way first. So I didn't realize I was also the first on this series. So I guess he's still doing it, but yeah. Anyway, everyone has chosen to be here, so that's great. Glad you're interested in using stats in economic development. So there's sort of two parts of what I'm talking about today. One is just finding stats. Where can you find the best stats and make sure you're getting the most value out of the stats you can find, which I think is particularly topical given that the census results are in the process of rolling out over the course of this year. And then towards the end, I'll talk a bit about some of the many different ways that stats can be used in economic development. And I think we'll leave a fair bit of time at the end for questions if you want anything specific you want to bring up. It's a very broad topic, so it's tough to hit all the angles, but I'll see what I can do. But I did think my experience has been that working with communities and different people in these fields over the years, that they often aren't sure. They're generally aware of where to find stats, but not necessarily where to get the most detail and the most valuable stats that they're looking for. So as I mentioned, there's many different ways that people use stats and data in economic development, from monitoring the community's health, reporting on progress, analyzing the impact of projects, understanding how your community or your area compares to others, many different applications. But I wanted to start with some of the basics. And this is, I think, an important topic when you're looking for Statscan data, which probably a lot of people will be doing this year with the census numbers coming out. The Statscan has a particular way that they show data by geography. And when you think about a given piece of data, there's the topic of the data, there's the timeliness of the data, but there's also the geographic area that data refers to. So I wanted to just refresh maybe for some of you, or introduce some of you to how Statscan does this. And there's basically 4 areas. All of these areas, the full census results will be released for each of these at each of these levels of geography. So at the highest level is the economic region. I've got some maps coming up to sort of illustrate these. If you work for a regional district, Statscan calls that a census division. So that's what you would be looking for. If you work for an individual municipality, that's called a census subdivision, but census subdivisions also include every single individual electoral area in the province, as well as every single individual First Nations reserve is a separate census subdivision. So there is data release. The only constraint is if you get down to really small population sizes, that does limit what is released. But in theory, the full census is released for all of these areas. And the other one is dissemination areas. So this hierarchy here is sort of it all interlocks. So an economic region is made up of different regional districts or census divisions. Each census division is made up of a number of census subdivisions, and each census subdivision is also made up of one or more dissemination areas. So especially if you're in a larger community, you can readily get data for individual neighborhoods or different sub areas within your community. And the full census is released at those areas as well. So just to quickly run through these, this is the economic regions or the development regions, as they call them in BC. There's 8 of them. Probably not getting a lot of census data, but you could. One of the ways this data is most readily, or these geographies are most readily used, is the monthly labor force survey that's released. It's not released down to a regional district level or a community level. It's released at these economic region levels, as well as the major metro areas. So that's one place you might see these geographies. This is just the regional districts that's within the census, the economic regions. Now this map is of the Nanaimo regional district, and it illustrates the different types of census subdivisions. So the ones that are in sort of this light orangey color are the municipalities: Nanaimo, Lanceville, Parksville, Qualicum Beach, and so on. You can see each of the individual electoral areas: Nanaimo F, C, A, B, and so on, as well as the reserves. So Nanoose, Nanaimo Town, Qualicum, and so on. So there's full census profiles available for each of those individual areas. The dissemination areas, now these are determined by population size. So they're designed to each hold between 400 and 700 people. So if you're in an urban area, this is the town of Comox, you can see you've got quite a number of dissemination areas within a given community. So this is sort of the central part of Comox with the waterfront on the bottom. Sort of the combined downtown area of Comox would have a couple different dissemination areas within it. If you're in a slightly less populated area, this is Gabriola Island, the entire island still has, what is that, about 7 dissemination areas, but not quite as geographically small because there's fewer people. They're a bit more spread out in Gabriola. And this is the rural area. I know it's hard to see. It doesn't matter the details. It's the city of Terrace in the center. And you can see so these green numbers around the edge. These are the individual dissemination areas encompassing huge areas because there's very few people living in those areas. Other than, you can see right to the north of the city here, there's a relatively small one where there's more population that's living just outside the city. So it really depends on the population density, how large those dissemination areas are. The other ones I wanted to touch on, so those are all, those first 4 all fit together. They cover the entire country, is in one of those 4 areas. There's a few other specialized ones. Designated places I wanted to touch on. This is mostly unincorporated settlements, and I'm going back to my Nanaimo map here. And if you look at all of these individual green communities, so these are generally, traditional old towns within rural areas of the province. So Hilliers, Coombs, Arrington, those are somewhat distinct communities. And I think a lot of this is historically driven, but they have separate census profiles for each of those as well, even though they're not a separate, political jurisdiction. It's really hit and miss. It sort of depends. You just have to look if you're interested in a particularly small place, whether they have one or not. They're mostly these types of settlements within rural areas. Sometimes they are actually within municipalities. I think they're sort of historically determined. The other couple levels just to touch on quickly. So census metropolitan areas and census agglomerations. These are the larger agglomerations where communities are located nearby. They all function essentially as a single economy. Census metropolitan areas have at least 100,000 people and 50,000 in the urban core. Traditionally, there was only 4 in BC for the last 20 years or so, but there's 3 new ones starting as of this year, the 2021 census numbers coming out. So Nanaimo, Kamloops, and Chilliwack have all hit that threshold. And what that means, it doesn't make that much different for the census because everyone gets census numbers, but a lot of the other data sources that Statscan puts out are available only at the CMA level. So there'll be much more ongoing and more regular data for Nanaimo, Kamloops, Chilliwack. And these are not just the central, like city of Nanaimo, it's an agglomeration. So it's Nanaimo and some of the surrounding rural areas, Lantzville. They're each defined essentially based on the level of commuting and the relationships of the local economy in each case. Stepping a bit down from that, census agglomerations, they each have an urban core of at least 10,000 people. So those are the ones in BC. You can see Prince George slowly working its way towards becoming a CMA. I would say probably within the next maybe 15 or 20 years, hopefully they get there, and stretching all the way down to Prince Rupert at about 13,000 people. So again, these have a bit more data than a regular census subdivision, but they're an agglomeration. They're a combination of an individual municipality with some surrounding rural and sometimes First Nations communities. Just depends on the individual area. And the final one, Census Tracts. These are not, they don't cover the entire country, just parts of the census metro areas and some of the larger agglomerations. They're a bit bigger than dissemination areas, but they also sort of follow neighborhood type areas. This is a city of Kelowna. This is the highway going north through Kelowna here. So these numbers in red are a census tract. So you can get data for those sub areas as well. Each census tract is also made up of the dissemination area. So you can go even lower than that. That's what these are. Anyway, that's your quick crash course in census geography. Looking at the census topics, so we're about partway through the releases that are coming out this year. Started in February with the basic population and dwelling counts. Unfortunately, for economic development, some of the most valuable stuff happens at the very end. So it's not till the end of November that you see the data for labor. So that includes all the employment data, employment by industry, employment by occupation, education, if you're interested in the level of qualifications and the skill level in your local population, commuting data. All of that happens right at the very end of November. The housing release is tomorrow. That's also of great interest to a lot of people. And traditionally, Statscan hasn't done a great job with data for Indigenous communities. They've essentially been treated like every other little geographic area on the province, and sometimes with very low population sizes, or sometimes if the participation rates are low, that the amount of data that comes out is not as high. So I'm not sure exactly what this looks like. There is a new sort of category of releases they're putting out tomorrow. I think they're trying to make an effort to have better data for Indigenous peoples. So I think it remains to be seen exactly what that looks like when that comes out tomorrow. Now I'm going to switch from here to actually looking at the internet. 1 second. Got to switch my share. Make sure I get the right one. Okay, so I wanted to walk you through some of the ways to get data from Statscan. This is essentially the main Statscan page once you go in here. If we start on the top here, there's a data bar. This is not specific to the census. If we go into this data section, and I hope everyone can see this okay, this is literally sort of like a portal to every piece of data that Statscan has. So the easiest thing to do is just to go into this data area and type in a keyword for whatever you're looking for. So if we use something like migration, it will filter down and provide over to the right here all the different releases they have that relate to migration. And you can filter it further on the left here. Some of the, if you were interested only in census data, you can click that filter here. But also really valuable is this, this geography filter. So especially if you're in a smaller community, you're probably frustrated that a lot of the data you're interested in might not be available. But if you can find your level down here, you might be able to find what you're looking for. So census subdivision, for example, there's 9 releases that have a census subdivision data. So for example, you can look at this components of population change by census division. So that's just one way to get at data, and that you can go to that at any point in time. That's not census specific. That's how you get to any sort of Statscan data. And there's much, much more beyond the census. I wanted to, so this is what a typical data table looks like when you open it up. It's usually got some different variables along the top here. And this is one I was working on recently, some asset management type analysis, and looking at the lifespan of different assets, and it's got data by each province here. One useful thing to do if you go into a Statscan table, there's this button here, it's consistent, called Add Remove Data, because what they show you on the screen when you first go into a sheet is often only a small part of what's actually available here. And there's multiple variables here, so you can see this is the geography section. We can literally open this up and just click down to exactly what we're looking for. So if we go to BC, and type of municipality by population size, they actually allow us to select not just all municipalities, but the specific ones that we're looking for. So we can get data for exactly the type of area that we're looking for. And none of that was obvious when you first went into this type of table. So you can click on that and get some data that might be more representative of the area that you're actually looking at. If we go back to the census, let's see here. I'm just going to back up 1 second. Let me just go back to the beginning. So you can see how we got here. So again, we're going into the main Statscan page. Okay, this is where I want to start. Okay, so the census, you got to find your way to the main census page within Statscan. There's a couple different ways to access data here. One of the easiest, if we scroll down, is something called a Census Profile. And if we open that up, this is sort of like a snapshot of all of the different census data for a particular geography. So you can search your way through here. You can go down through the province and go down further if you like, or you can literally just enter the name of a place here. So if we enter a fairly small community, Wells, it'll pull up all of the different communities across Canada that have the word Wells in them. So if we're interested in Wells, British Columbia, we would just check the one at the bottom here. And as I said, we're only partway through the census releases for this year. So this is just giving a snapshot of all the census data released so far. But if we scroll down here, it's got a piece of all the different types of data that have come out so far. And this will continue to grow as the rest of the census releases come out. If you want to do some comparisons, you can add a geography here. So you can add 5 additional ones and see how they stack up next to Wells. Let's see here. Just backing up to the main census page again. So that was the census profiles. If you want to go into the individual data tables, this is a good snapshot of where we're at in the census releases. The ones on the left here that have the hyperlinks enabled, that's where the data exists so far. So you might be interested in income data, for example. So you can go into the income section. All the ones over here have no hyperlink yet. Those are the ones that are not released. Okay, it looks like they do have a previews of what's coming out for the stuff for tomorrow. I haven't dug into that in great detail yet. So this is a different way to go at this. If you're interested in income, for example, if we click on income, it will pull up all the different types of income tables. And it'll just have a description of what's in that table, what's the geography level that it's available at, and so on. You just have to scroll through or do a Control F and try to find what you're looking for. So that's a different way to look at it. So I'm back at the main census page here. So we did the census profiles, we did the data tables. If we scroll down a bit further, this one, we did census profiles. You can also search by a community and just see all the census data that's available for that place. So if you take another individual community, municipality of Vanderhoof, you can actually scroll down and see all the different census tables that have data at the level of Vanderhoof, at the census subdivision level. So instead of searching through the data tables and trying to find the right one for your size of community, you can just enter the community name and it'll show you all of the data, all of the different tables that have data for your community. And if you are interested, I know some people on the call, I believe, were, I don't know if there's some business associations or BIAs that might have a sub-municipal area. You would have to figure out the name of there's like a numeric code that would apply to each individual area, but you could enter that here in the same way, and it would give you the data you're looking for. I'm not going to show it to you today, but there is a different part of this. There's a geography section where you can find maps, and you could, for example, find the dissemination area map for your community and look what numbers correspond to the areas you're interested in, and then use those instead of a community name. Just enter that numeric code here, the geographic code, and it would work the same way. Something else you might be interested in: census data sets. This is the historic. So how this is set up, there's a drop down here where you can easily access data for all different census years going back to 1981 if you're interested in looking at any trends over time. And unfortunately, there's not really an easy geographic, like a specific name to filter here, but you can filter down by the level. So if you're a census subdivision, individual municipality, or a census tract or dissemination area, or census division, a regional district, you could just click that and it will tell you all of the data tables available at that level. So if we went back to 1991, it would show all of the census tables from 1991 that are available for the regional district level, although some of them have changed, obviously, in that time. Something else I wanted to show you was, I'm just going to jump to a different data table. This is just a different table within the census. It's some family detail. So when we first open up the table, it looks like this. See some of the variables up top here. It gives you a summary of the data. As I suggested earlier, you can go into add, remove data and filter down to just British Columbia or the type of level of geography you're interested in. But what I wanted to show you instead was this download options button. Generally speaking, most of the data that you can see on the page in the Statscan website is readily available for download for free. So if you're interested in acquiring the data, you think you might use it again, you want to put it in a spreadsheet and use it for some analysis, whatever, you can easily access that. There's a bunch of different options they provide here. So all of these different CSVs are just text files, and there's options to download just what's on the screen. You can download the entire table. So this table has data for all of Canada for this family type data. So you could, at the click of a button, go here and download data for every geography across Canada for all of these different variables. At some point, you will run into a problem where your data tables, if you're planning to put this into Excel, where there's too many data points to literally fit into Excel, even though it has more than 1 million rows of data, there's quite a few data tables that will exceed that once you get into all the different variables within each community. But I did want to show you one more thing. So that's this B2020. Now, this is an option Statscan provides for downloading census data. It's short for Beyond 2020. And it is a very useful program that a lot of people don't know about. Sorry, but I need to stop sharing my web browser and share. Is it going to let me do that? I wonder if it won't let me show. Oh, there it is. I just had to scroll down. Okay, so I'm not sure if you can see this very well on your screen. So this is an example. It looks somewhat like a spreadsheet. This is an example of some housing data actually from the 2016 census. So it's got tenure of housing and housing suitability. And there's a bunch of other variables sitting up here. You can see the geography, household type. The value of this is that you can easily move your data around and sort of nail down and isolate exactly what you're looking for. So you might be interested in, okay, you can literally grab a variable here and pull it, and it'll flip the orientation of the table. You can grab a variable up at the top here, the geography. I'm just going to pull this down here to the left, And now we have data for every geography in the province for housing tenure. All census data is released in this format. So you could get, and you could play around with any different census table. There's some ways to search here. I've already filtered this table for British Columbia. But for example, if we were working in the Trail area and we wanted to focus just on the municipalities around Trail, we could highlight those. I'm just going to right click and hit show. And now it's going to filter my table down to just those municipalities around Trail. The different household variables here. So household size, for example, if I grab that and pull that down to the top, now we can see average household size for each municipality near Trail. I can also just focus on that variable. Just going to pull that back out. And you can also nest variables within each other. So instead of having just one variable by the other, if we want to look at number of rooms, number of bedrooms, I can grab that and pull it, just sort of nest it here underneath here. And now it's, sorry, one second, I'm going to make this easier to see. Actually, let's just focus on average household size. So average household size for by number of bedrooms. And we can change the data so it has decimal places, which would be easier to look at. You can nest any number of variables here. So housing suitability, if you want to bring that back in, you can nest housing suitability within the municipalities and look at that, by, all these different combinations of data. So instead of just looking at an average number for BC or an average number for an entire community, you can really use this tool to fairly easily focus in on exactly what you might be looking for. Okay, so that is beyond 2020. Just going to go back to my PowerPoint. 1 second. And I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but okay. So that was sort of your crash course in Statscan data. I think hopefully it's timely and useful for you with the census numbers coming out. Oh, I should actually I'll get to that. But lots of other data sources as well beyond Statscan. So BC Stats provides a number of sort of prepackaged data sources. A lot of it is ultimately Statscan data, but they're prepackaging it for British Columbia. So, for example, they'll provide easily downloadable spreadsheets that are already set up for BC, whether regional districts or individual communities. They also release a lot of data that comes from elsewhere in the province. So the corporations registry, they have the number of new business incorporations by community set up in a spreadsheet. Usually they provide all the historic data, so that can go back a number of decades. It's not necessarily comprehensive. It really depends on how large a community is. It's generally better for regional districts and municipalities, less so for rural areas and reserves, but you would just have to see. And there's a variety of different topics here. They link to special studies and a number of other sources. If you're interested in more geographic types of data, so IMAP BC is one of the provincial tools that allows custom mapping. They generally link to a lot of the census data and other provincial data with a geographic element, sometimes with a physical features element or geological data or whatever it might be. Combine things and look at it in a map-based tool. Other common public sources for data, there are many. So CMHC, a lot of data for housing starts, rental vacancies, and so on. Canada Revenue Agency provides income data from actual tax returns with a couple-year lag. Various other provincial government sources, real estate boards, commercial realtors. People are interested in a lot of real estate data, generally speaking, and there's some good sources depending on, as always, the larger the community, generally the better the data that's available. Those are all of the generally free sources that are out there. There's a number of emerging data sources I wanted to touch on quickly. More and more there's private companies that provide access to big data tools. Urban Logic is a local BC company that purchases and provides dashboards to allow a lot of communities to use really advanced data, whether it comes from cell phone data. So if it's a tourism-oriented project, or They get data from like vehicle tracking, like the OnStar type systems. They've had communities that have identified where potholes are based on the vibration impacts on OnStar data. Those sort of really interesting tools. Pretty specialized applications probably, but they are out there, and TELUS provides some of those as well. The problem with a lot of the employment data, as I mentioned, it's coming out at the end of November of this year. So when it comes out, it's already a year and a half old, and it just gets more and more old as the years go on. It's usually the best and most detailed data available for an individual community, but in a lot of cases, especially for larger communities, you want to have more regularly updated data. There's a number of private companies that will pull a number of sources together and estimate what those employment numbers might be. So companies like Manifold, MZ, I would trust them more for larger communities. I've never personally used those sources a lot. I tend to do my own thing, but I'd be interested in looking at how they compare to census numbers and reconciling them over time. But anyway, the data is out there if you're interested in exploring that. One of the other problems that communities have with data is finding the data, keeping track of it, making it readily available, whether through a website or for their clients. So Ruby Industries is an Okanagan-based company that will provide online tools. I think they've done some of these webinars in the past where they will update the data for you, create some sort of data visualization tools for your community and just sort of automate and make the process easier. When new data comes out, they will update it. You don't have to worry about it. Local Intel is one of the multiple companies that provides marketing websites, so community profile type information. So again, they will update the data and make it readily available on the website. So if you want to or have resources to pay for some of these tools, they can make your life a lot easier. But anyway, just wanted to introduce you to those to show that there are other sources besides the basic, Statscan, BC Stats. I think in a lot of cases, especially municipalities, don't take advantage of some of the data they have available internally, whether it's business license data, any survey data, or through BRE programs, development-related data, special studies. A lot of this could be used and analyzed in more detail. It's often not collected for that purpose, so it may not be perfect in terms of data quality, but anyway, it's something else if you're interested in doing more data work to look at what might be available within your organization or within your community. Now, I have mostly talked about data sources, but I want to just spend about 5 minutes or a bit more maybe talking about how some of this data would be used. So one of the ways is just to analyze your community or your area and see how it compares, whether it's to market the area, just to identify what your strategic strengths and weaknesses might be, to show how you're changing over time. If I had one message over anything else, I would say context is everything. I mean, I spend a lot of my time living in data, but if someone just tells me their number is this, I have a really hard time knowing what that means unless it has some context around it. Either is that higher or lower than it used to be? How does that compare to the next door community, or how does that compare to other communities that have a similar economy, all that sort of thing. So I think it's really more useful to always provide a comparison. So how this is often done with employment data. So this is data for the Langley Township. If we just focus on the 2016 employment numbers, you can see retail, trade, manufacturing are the largest industries in Langley. They're the biggest industries in a lot of communities. So I'm not sure if that's telling you a whole lot, especially with retail, healthcare. Those are usually among the top 3 any place you look at. So if your website says those are your top industries, it's not really telling anything that's specific or unique to your community or your place. But how you can do something a bit more interesting is to do a relative scale. So this is a very common economic development analytical tool called location quotients. So it's basically saying not only how many jobs, but how does the number of jobs compare to reference area. So this is how does the Langley Township employment compare to the entire British Columbia economy. So to show how this is calculated, my example here, construction. So construction was 5.45% of all the jobs in Langley. It was 4.07% of all the jobs in BC. Just take the first number divided by the second number, you get 1.35. So if we go over to our chart here, what that means is 1 is sort of the average level. So it's saying Langley on average has 35% more than the BC economy overall. So construction is a relative strength, or it's got a high relative concentration within Langley. The ones above that on this chart are even higher. So manufacturing, agriculture, no surprise, are really highly concentrated in Langley compared to the rest of the province. And if you got highly concentrated, you've also obviously got things on the bottom. So not a lot of big government offices, regionally or provincially in Langley. So public administration is one that's less than half as concentrated. So I think this provides a much more useful and interesting way to look at the relative composition of the Langley economy, as opposed to this chart, which just has the basic numbers. Actually, I'm going to skip that one. So you can also do the same sort of relative concentration with occupations. So obviously I did some work in Langley, so I'm just using the charts from there. But so again, if 1 is the average scale for the rest of BC, so how does the Langley labor force by occupation compare to the rest of the province? So it scores the highest on trades, transport, and equipment operators. There's a relative concentration of those types of workers in Langley compared to the rest of the province. And you can see some of the ones in the bottom there: natural and applied sciences, health, manufacturing, utilities, and so on. So this provides a more interesting and informative picture of the relative strengths of the local labor force, as opposed to just the raw numbers. Oh yeah, and you can also change the base. So I'm comparing this as compared to BC. This one is compared to Canada. The picture sometimes can look a little bit different because the BC economy and the Canadian economy are not the same. This is one that looked at different skill levels, many different ways to look at this. One of the things I like to do if I'm doing a bigger project for a community is to sort of create a common benchmarking group. So not just to compare to BC or to compare to Canada, but to create a group of communities that are similar in some way. I think people get a lot of value out of seeing how they compare. They might think they're similar to someone else, but are they actually better or worse? It's usually pretty interesting to local elected officials if you can say you're number 1 in this or whatever it might be. So did some work in Ladysmith, for example, looked at communities that were a similar population range, had similar types of economies. So generally southern part of the province, somewhat recreation, retirement oriented, Vancouver Island, Okanagan, Kootenays. There's the communities that I picked, and then just doing a consistent set of comparisons of Ladysmith. It doesn't have to be 15 as this one is. It could be 3, it could be 5, 7, whatever it might be. But I think there's value, and it's interesting to see the same group of comparables over time. So this is the education of the workforce, for example. Yeah, so Langley's is a bit more complicated. My benchmarking group, I looked across the country. I don't need to go into these details, but anyway, it can be as simple or as complicated as you want to make those comparison groups. And I want to leave some time for questions. So just a couple other final tips. I wanted to mention with the census, because it's really important data, the labor employment data. The default for all census data that is released is by place of residence. So if you look at a data table for your community for employment, that's the employment of the people who live there. And if you're in economic development, you might be more interested in the jobs that are based in your community. And if you're a relatively standalone community, it probably doesn't make that much difference. So I think someone from Quesnel was on this call. So there's a bit of commuting in and out from Quesnel to the surrounding rural areas. But generally speaking, Quesnel is by far the largest community in that area. Probably not a lot of difference between the jobs, people who live in Quesnel, and the jobs with a place of work in Quesnel. But if you work in a metro community, especially if you're not one of the central ones, we could use my Langley example again, or I've just done a bunch of work in Port Moody. The composition of jobs of people who live there can be quite different from the people who work there. So the Port Moody labor force is very highly skilled, has a lot of jobs in professional services and a lot of relatively highly paid jobs, which is somewhat different than the jobs that are based in Port Moody. So unfortunately, Statscan does not generally provide this data for the place of work for free. Sometimes they have in the past. It really depends on the census. I'm not sure what it's going to look like this time, but usually you have to do a custom data order. You can order data based on where the jobs are located as opposed to where the people live. But just to flag that, I think it's a common misconception in my course last year. I think someone from Delta mentioned that someone was arguing something to her in Delta with employment data, and they were using place of residence, but it had nothing to do with the jobs that were in Delta. So it's just to flag that as a common error that you can make. Commuting data is often very useful, especially in larger areas where you have multiple communities living together. So the census at the end of November will have, and this is free, every single commuting flow across Canada where people live in one place and work in a different place, and there's at least 20 people going from one to the other. So I've done a lot of work with this over the time, looking at regional economies and the level of integration. Historically working in the Comox Valley, they had a regional economic development organization. So we would try to make the argument that this was a very integrated regional economy. We showed with commuting data that less than half the people lived and worked in the same place. They more often worked somewhere that was not the community they actually lived in. So you can do that type of analysis. You can see where communities are net inflow of workers. City of Richmond brings in a lot more people than it sends out just because of the airport and some of the major employment centers. Most of the outer suburban areas send a lot more workers away, but you can see all those relationships. And I think that's probably where I'm going to leave this. There's some more detailed stuff I got into, but I think I'm going to cut that off and not talk too much longer. But anyway, I hope that provided you with some useful background, and happy to take any questions that you have.
Hi, Jamie. Thanks for that. That's it is always an interesting topic, and as you know, statistics are really used for a large variety of different things at the community level. It's not just from local economic development. It's looking at everything from infrastructure to growth in the community or not growth, but it's also important to look sort of regionally. A couple of questions that have come up, and one is the issue of, do you have to pay for the information coming off Statistics Canada's site?
No, all of the tables that I showed when I was doing that little demonstration, all of that is free.
Yeah, go ahead.
All of the basic census numbers are free. It's only if you get into the custom employment data that I mentioned, or you can have Statscan create custom geographies, for example. They will do a lot more, but there's all kinds of stuff that's free.
But you have to, if you want them to do more than you pay for it. And I guess the same with BC Stats. And BC Stats used to do those community profiles. I think this has been talked about just about every single webinar we've done around statistics. Are they continuing to do those? Or they've stopped those, I believe, haven't they?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think most of the great stuff that BC Stats used to do is gone. It's kind of sad.
I don't think it's coming back. It's a skeleton crew there that's there now. It's hard for them to do it. But at the same time, the province has released a new tool as well. And I noticed you didn't mention it, and I apologize for bringing this up, but it has been a question that was brought up. Was the community information tool that I think it was Citizen Services actually has launched. Are you familiar with that, and what are your thoughts?
That sounds familiar. There's a number of organizations that I think it's probably just linking to census and other StatsCan data, I'm guessing, but packaging it for a community. So I can't say I've looked at it recently. It sounds familiar, but so I can't really comment in detail.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not going to go into a big presentation about it. It's a tool that's there. I think for those communities that are aware of it, because it did get brought up in the questions, I think what's really important when you're looking, because I have looked at this tool for a couple of different communities, and also the province has given a presentation on it, and maybe we need to do another presentation. with the province on this tool. But I think when you're looking at this tool, don't just look at your own communities. And it's really important to look sort of regionally when you look at this tool, because you will find that you'll say, oh, well, it doesn't have these services showing, even though we have them. Well, they might not be right in your community, but it's also important to not only use those stats for that exactly the same reason. You don't want to limit yourself to just the services or what's available in your own community. You want to look at it from a regional perspective. So whatever you're gathering statistics, make sure you're looking regionally, because when you're talking to an investor or somebody wanting to invest in your community, you're going to want to make sure that you have a much broader statistical draw for your community than what your own community's boundaries offer. So anybody else have any questions that they'd like to jump in with? No questions? Well, Jamie, I thank you very much for doing this again. And we, of course, as you know, are not doing the course this year, so that part is, you know, it's too bad, but we had to make that decision to cancel it, and we will bring it back next year with sort of a revised format that we're looking at doing some major changes to that course, and bringing in a lot of different people for it. And I think it'll be you know, an interesting an agenda item for people to budget for and to schedule for next fall. We are working on our conference as well, which will take place April the 16th to the 18th. I don't believe we've officially announced the location yet, so I won't talk about that. Ashley has mentioned in the chat that we are releasing manuals on each of these topics that we are doing the webinars on. Some of the manuals are launched already. Some are about to get launched over the next 2 weeks. And so, you know, stay tuned. There's more to come, and our opportunity is to really provide our members and our communities, regardless of membership status, throughout the province with as much information as we can possibly provide to help you with your economic development programming. So thanks very much. Thank you, Jamie. And we'll see some of you probably tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yep, bye now.